which is organized by the Central Texas African American Family Support Conference and Integral Care. The conference's vision, of course, is to educate the African American community on the mental health and substance use disorder and intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as the total well-being of African Americans. We hope this forum today will provide the opportunity for you to participate in conversation that offer education, encouragement, and resources. So we have a very few housekeeping rules. Number one, please always keep yourself on mute. There will be time for interaction, so you may raise your virtual hand and unmute yourself when you're called upon to talk. And very importantly, if you get emotional or overwhelmed, please turn off your video and handle your emotions privately. But at the same time, if you need to talk to someone, Integral Care is there 24/7. The hotline number is 512-472-4357. 512-472-4357. Also, there are CEUs available, and you should be able to find those links in the chat boxes, and the instructions also are included. I think Lady Jane has already commented. So knowing that it will be recorded and it is streaming live, we want you all to keep a smiling face on camera if you can. So today's topic is a conversation, a two-part conversation on school to prison pipeline and youth reentry. Our panelists today are Mr. Carl F. Hunter II, Executive Director of Building Promises USA, Craig Moore, a former prosecutor, adjunct professor. He is currently the Executive Director of Jail to Jobs, and Mr. Bob Lilly, criminal justice and participatory defense organizer with grassroots leadership and a person with lived experiences. So we welcome you to this forum today, and please relax, listen, learn, and do not hesitate to type in your questions if there's something that needs clarity or you have additional feedback. So I am going to start today, part one of the school to prison pipeline. And I want to be able to start with Brother Rob Lilly. And he's going to paint, if you will, a picture of his young self before he got involved with the criminal justice system. So I yield now to Brother Bob Lilly. Welcome, Bob.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many faces that have tuned in for this conversation today. My hope and my prayer is that as a result of this, you'll have some answers, but we don't anticipate you receiving all of them. With that said, I just want to begin with a quotation that I feel very appropriate to share before I launch into any personal commentary. It's a quote from a book entitled On Man by Adolphe Quetelet, and he writes, "Society itself contains the germs of all crimes committed. It is the social state in some measure, it is a social state in some measure which prepares these crimes, and the criminal is merely the instrument which executes them." I chose that quotation because there's no way that I can talk about my life without talking about my life within the context of society and how society and institutions have shaped my life. And so, quite appropriately, I believe that the crimes that my life became embodied by were prepared for me before I was even born because of the structural nature of our society. And we'll intend to prove that as we develop our thought. So how do I want to begin? I was asked to kind of contextualize by going back to my younger self. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s. If you know anything about New York City in the 1970s, there was extreme blight in the South Bronx where I was born, and I was born in Harlem, but raised in the South Bronx. There was extreme blight. The conditions there were not a result of the people just simply having no regard for their community, but rather they were the result of neglect, graft, and abuse of power. And as a result of that, the common person in that city suffered. Trash was not picked up. Uh, there was no police protection in the community. In fact, the police were not even favored in our community because they were abusers. And here we were as young children trying to navigate all of these complex social realities with no real idea of what that meant in terms of achieving like some semblance of social acceptance, right? We just were trying to survive. My mother and my father were not married. My father was far older than my mother when they met. They met at church. He had already had one family, and he left that woman with 13 children, and he would eventually, migrate from one relationship to the next until he found my mother, of whom he had 4 children with. I'm the oldest of 4 children. My childhood was, generally speaking, uh, uneventful until my mother's passing. And when I say uneventful, I wasn't really conscious of the world until probably about 7, 8, 9 years of age. But in the early stages of my life, we had a home. My father worked every day. He was a tradesman. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. She had a clean residence. She protected us from things going on outside of the home. Generally speaking, it was a regular childhood. But then unexpectedly, she passed away from a kidney failure. That is the point in which I marked the transition of my life. And the transformation of my life, because the main provider that was there to guard me and engage with me was now gone. My father was a provider, but he wasn't much of a communicator. So as a result of that, I'm now left with the responsibility of caring for my younger siblings and navigating what it meant to grow up in an environment that was riddled with violence and drugs and blight. I wasn't prepared for it. The school systems that I interacted with were places where I didn't feel welcomed. I didn't feel appreciated as a human being, and in fact, I felt very much out of place there. I felt like I was perceived. I didn't have words to describe what I felt. I would just plead with my father, "Don't take me to school. I don't want to go to school." I didn't feel like it was a place where I would be educated. I felt like I was being subjected to negative treatment that was unsavory and on every level. With that said, my misbehavior did not become legally problematic until I would move from New York to California. Now I'm not only dealing with the death of my mother, which I had never processed and learned how to grieve, but I'm also now dealing with the shock of displacement from the home, the only home that I ever knew. As bad as it was the home that I knew. I knew how to navigate. I knew how to travel. Now I'm in a new place with new circumstances that I'm barely understanding. And this is the mid '80s, and we're at the height of the gang epidemic in New California. School was not a place for learning for me. It was a place for me to find some kind of tribe to belong to so that I could survive. Um, my peers became my coaches that helped me navigate the streets. Education was superficial at best. I did acquire some degree of proficiency in reading that would later on become, my saving grace. How that happened, I can't adequately recall to you because I have no recollection of any teacher that I ever felt gave me the benefit of the doubt as a student that could learn. My most prominent teachers, what I would come in contact with as a result of my entering into the juvenile system around the age of 13 and 14, 15, by the age of 15, I would be cycled in and out of the system where I would stay for 3 years from 15, and I would come home at 18, excuse me, 19, turning 19. So, as you could just hear from my quick synopsis of my early life, the reality was that I was in survival mode. I was determined to figure out how to negotiate a world that I had no real conceptualization of. There was no real teacher there to tell me. My father, he showed me how to use tools, but he didn't help me understand people. He showed me how to work, but he didn't help me to understand why I was working, because he was working and he was poor. And now, mind you, again, after my mother died, our economic situation was tremendously destabilized. Whereas he had somebody to care for the children when she was alive. Now we were latchkey kids. That was a term that would come later in the decades. But now I'm home, and I have to guard over my siblings. I have to protect myself, and I have to be an adult. And I wasn't prepared to be an adult. I was a child, and I needed my childhood, and unfortunately, that childhood was stripped from me as a result of circumstances beyond my control. And now I'm responsible for making life decisions for survival's reasons that were deemed criminal in our societies. But excuse me, no, but and uh, I failed to understand and could not see, because again, no one was there to help me understand this, that in 20, 30, 40 years from that point, my life would be circumscribed by those decisions. So I'm gonna yield there. I don't necessarily know how abbreviated you want that to be, but that's in a nutshell of what I think is important for me to indicate when we're talking about my early upbringing. Let me see if there's any other point that I want to make right quick before I yield back to the moderator. Um, yeah, my father, one thing that I want to mention again about my father, I heard a minister once say that children are good interpreters, excuse me, they're good observers and they're poor interpreters. So I saw the decisions that my father was making, but I didn't understand them. He had to find another woman in order to care for us. I considered his decisions betraying me and my siblings. And so I resented my father as a result of that, because some of these women that stepped into our lives were not really desirous of being mothers to us. They wanted companionship from him. And we were just incidental to that relationship. And so as a result of that, I lashed out. And all of these complex emotional challenges that I'm describing, these are the things that this young boy walked into the schoolroom with that had no words for. There were no words that I could describe anything that I was telling you by then. And no one that I ever recall come to me and say, hey, let me talk to you. What's going on? What's happening at home? Is there anything? None of that ever happened. And so the only time I interacted with authority figures in the school context was if they deemed my behavior inappropriate and they singled me out for punishment. And so it was only recently, and I'll yield with this, it was only recently that I learned uh, that I am in fact an embodiment of the school to prison pipeline. I was arrested in the school multiple times and entered into the juvenile system, where I would then eventually be prepared for the adult prison system. And altogether at 53 years of age, I've spent approximately 21 years of my life cycling in and out of this horrible process. And that's why I'm on this call today, to shed some light on this topic. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, Brother Bob. You've really painted a picture, one that I think may be familiar to a lot of the folks who are participating today in this forum. One of the things that we hear, of course, is the trauma, the complex trauma that you indicate, the grief, the anger, and then that delinquent behavior and reactions in life. And the fact that you did not have anyone necessarily to help you at that point. Just briefly, can you tell me a little bit about what led to your delinquent behavior?
Okay, if I was to be quite clear, I would tell you that I'm surrounded by young men that are no different than me. Every one of these kids that I was calling my friend, we all came from circumstances that were challenged. We either had a loved one that was incarcerated, or we had witnessed some kind of violence, or we were being abused. And so generally speaking, we all were wounded, and we sought comfort in each other. We became our solace. Our relationships became our escape. And we thought together we were invincible. And under those circumstances, we're going to do what any young child is going to do. We're going to experiment with life. We're going to make, rash decisions. We're going to take risks. But at the end of the day, we were no different than any other child in this world. We just happened to be in a community that was over policed. And so any misbehavior that we engaged in, like some of my early arrests were for trespassing. I was, exploring construction sites because I was intrigued by the large equipment on the site. And so I crossed over the line, went into the construction site. Police were called, and now I'm engaging with an arrogant police officer that cares little for my humanity. He's manhandling me, and I develop a resentment towards him. And next thing I know, I'm in handcuffs, and my father or my stepmother is pleading for my release or my return home. There were other incidents. Some of my early misbehavior resulted from lack of, adequate food in the household. When my father married his stepwife, she had a large number of siblings, children, and this house was one where the refrigerator was not something you could just liberally go in and out of. So, there were times when I think my early mischief, my early thievery began, just simply going to the store to steal some snacks, some cheese and some crackers. But I didn't have it in my mind that I was going to be this bandit. I mean, it was just simple pleasures that I wanted, like toys, food. But eventually, when drugs was introduced into this equation, now my criminal behavior was no longer about just simply meeting my basic childhood needs. It was about supporting and supplying a habit that was far more complex than I was ever prepared for when I took my first drink or drug.
Well, thank you for that. That continues to paint the picture for us. Today, we're talking about the school to prison pipeline. In the early 80s, the Children's Defense League began to talk about the cradle to grave prison pipeline. And that was something that really brought about a lot of attention. But since then, we've not heard much. So we're excited to have this discussion today about the school to prison pipeline. Could you just offer us what that is?
As I understand the school to prison pipeline, it is a series of events that transpires within the public school district and or school systems where behavior that is deemed inappropriate, problematic, even criminal is not processed within the strictures of the school policy as school discipline worthy, but then becomes amplified as a result of having law enforcement in the school context.
Mhm.
These offenses then become criminal offenses, and thus begins the process of a young person engaging with the criminal legal system and ultimately finding themselves being ushered into juvenile and ultimately adult prison context.
Mhm. Now, thank you for that. I want to be able to open up this same sort of examination for you, Carl Hunter, as well as you, Craig Moore. If you will offer us any information that you have as it relates to painting that picture for the school to prison pipeline, how that might relate to Texas, how it might relate to Black and brown kids.
Thank you, Brother Hayes. I think Rob really laid it out clearly and plainly. It's about criminalizing behavior in the school settings that, quite frankly, should be taken care of as a disciplinary action, not as a criminal referral. And I think we as a society have a tendency to over-criminalize behavior, disciplinary conduct, kids acting out, talking back to teachers. All of a sudden, it's an assault charge, a Class A misdemeanor. How did that happen? And so we have, it's that slope of criminalizing behavior that, quite frankly, could be taken care of with a call to the parent, sitting down, talking to the student, some type of mediation, restorative justice practices that a lot of schools are employing nowadays. And it's not just a Travis County issue. It's not just a state of Texas issue, but it's an issue affecting schools across the country, particularly for children of color.
Carl, do you have anything you could add to that?
Yeah, I get the pipeline thing, but let's look at how they look at our children. And there's this term, the adultification of Black children. You know, a 13-year-old Black child is looked upon as more of an adult than a white child, his white counterpart. And so there is that lack of innocence. And so now I'm looking at an adult behavior. In preparation for this, I read a bunch of articles because I felt intimidated by being with Robert and Craig. So I had to bone up on my side of the thing. And I learned a couple of words. And one of them is the adultification of Black children. The other one is the allostatic load, which is that thing. It refers to the cumulative effect of chronic stress has on the mental and physical health of a person. So when you look at the children, when I was listening to Robert's story, right? Look at the stress as a child that he has, and now he goes into a school system, right? And all the stresses of not eating, not having adequate food, not having what's going on in the household. When you talk about, when Craig was talking about, well, call the parents. Well, some of that stress might be in the household that they came from. So when we look at the school to prison pipeline, I'm in working with UT in whole communities, whole health. And a young lady, Elena Gonzalez, gave me this term, the womb to prison pipeline, because and when we talk about the allostatic load, Black women have the highest amount of stress with their men and their white counterparts. So you imagine the stress in the household and what that has with the fetus who comes out in the community. Now he's put into a household where there's all kinds of craziness going on, and then they go to school, right? And so when we have this discussion, we really need to go back to the causal source, right? And what's happening in the household to create some of those. Now racism is a part of the variables, but we have to have the other variables that are included that causes that stress, that causes that acting out, right? So yeah, that's my contribution to the conversation.
If I may, I'd just like to add one more piece to this dynamic. There are two things, actually. One is, and this to be very concise, one is, we in the 80s began to talk about this idea of zero tolerance, the notion that we were not going to tolerate any misbehavior in the school context, and we were going to root it out with punitive responses, i.e. in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension, and resource officers on campus. We had Columbine that created this veneer of fear about what's happening in our school systems, these mass shootings. And so police were resorted to as the stopgap solution for all of these matters, which in fact, the reality is police only respond after an incident occurs, not prior to it. But I want to mention a quote that one of my friends, Sarah Johnson, provided me with from Resma McKinnon. And he says, trauma, and this is in reference to the description of my life that I gave you, trauma decontextualized. That means you decontextualize trauma by looking at the person apart from the context of their existence. Trauma decontextualized in a person, unintended to and unexamined across time, can look like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family, untended to and unexamined across time, can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people, untended to and unexamined across time, can look like culture. And so in many of our schools, I think the children are being responded to in this adultification manner that you described, because we're not looked at within the context of our circumstances. We're looked at as if the source of our problems reside in our individual choices, and our choices are created in some sort of vacuum, and we're just deciding to misbehave. And as a result of that, we just need to be corrected, and thus therein is the solution.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate all of that feedback. But one of the things that also is challenging for many people is the misdiagnosis of our young people. as a result of some of their behavior. They may go through a lifetime, and certainly through their adolescent years to adulthood, with a conduct disorder diagnosis. And the challenge has been at Integral Care to begin to re-examine and to look at those diagnoses again, trying to make sense of why the youth are being diagnosed as such. Now, many of these youth are coming away from the schools with those diagnoses. And as a result of that, it leads directly into the juvenile justice system as a result of that. Craig, as a prosecutor, as a former prosecutor, you may understand and see the criminalizing behavior that occurs as a result of that. Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I saw that someone mentioned in the chat this idea of labeling theory. And I think that's very relevant because, you know, the consequences, well, several consequences of labeling theory is that, number one, if you label a child as a bad child or a problem child, not only is that child going to have the stigma of others and you know, believing that that child is bad, but I think the child begins to think, oh, well, wow, I really am a bad person, or I really can't do well in life. I really need to follow this path of destruction. And so labeling a child as such has very, very destructive consequences. But to Brother Hayes's point, yeah, I was a prosecutor for 14 years here in Travis County as a misdemeanor prosecutor and a felony prosecutor. And I also worked as a juvenile prosecutor, spent a lot of time at Gardner Betts working with the probation officers down there, the judges and what have you. And let me just say a few things about the role of the prosecutor first. I think, you know, in the entire sphere of the criminal justice system, the prosecutor has the most power, has the most important role to play, because the prosecutor is the one to decide whether or not a case needs to proceed. A prosecutor will give sentencing recommendations, a prosecutor will give punishment recommendations. And so ultimately, to have someone who believes in the power of redemption and reconciliation, restorative justice, that's very, very important. And you know, and it's good that we live in somewhat of a progressive county here in Travis County, but you look at all the other 253 counties in the state of Texas. You know, prosecutors in the state of Texas, and you know, interestingly enough, when it comes to practicing law, we all lawyers have just a general obligation that is mandated by state law, but prosecutors have a special duty. All right, their duty is not to seek convictions, but to see that justice is done. And I think that's very important because justice in one context could mean something very differently in another context, okay? And so when you're seeking justice, that really means, you know, what's going to be best for this child or this defendant in front of me? What's going to be best for the victim that was harmed, the person or the property that was harmed? What's going to be the benefit of the entire community? Taking all of those things into consideration to do what we all think is just. And, you know, I had a situation one time, and I'll just share this quick story. There was a young lady who, her and her boyfriend, she was a UT student, and she and her boyfriend got into a fight. And she made the mistake of picking up a knife and just, you know, swinging it at him. And it made contact with him, all right? So what did we have there? A second-degree aggravated assault. There was bodily injury, and she used or exhibited a deadly weapon, which is a knife, all right? A second-degree felony is 2 to 20 years in the state of Texas. And so that case landed on my desk. And here I have a young lady, UT student. She's never been in trouble before. You know, a lot of people would say, well, gosh, this is a domestic violence case, all right? This is really serious. But when I examined that case and I spoke to her, I spoke to the victim, of course. He didn't want to prosecute. I thought about, well, look, listen, what is justice in this case? Now, of course, I could have taken the case to trial and proven it. I had all the elements. I had bodily injury. We had the knife. We had a victim who had to go to the hospital. I could have met this case easily, all right? But to me, that wasn't justice. Justice was trying to figure out, all right, what is a result that the victim is happy with, that I'm happy with as a prosecutor, that we know that this young lady is going to be held accountable for her actions and that it won't happen again. So we were able to work out a resolution where it did not result in a criminal conviction on her record. That young lady graduated from UT, went on to grad school to do amazing things in her life, all right? And so right there, the prosecutor, I use that as an example to say that the prosecutor, whatever action that he or she takes on the case, can affect the trajectory of a defendant's life, okay? And that's really important. It's important that the prosecutors, not just misdemeanor prosecutors, but felony prosecutors really understand the importance of restorative justice practices. They understand that just because I can win a case, just because I can prove all elements at trial, doesn't mean I need to take the case to trial. Doesn't mean this case needs to result in a conviction. And here's the thing, folks, with the conviction, there are so many collateral consequences that comes with the conviction on your record. You can never get it off your record if you have a conviction. You can't serve on the jury with a felony conviction. All right, there are some jobs, some licenses in the state of Texas that you cannot receive with a criminal conviction. You know, it can affect your request for financial aid, for government aid, for housing, all types of consequences with a criminal conviction. That's why I think the role of the prosecutor in deciding whether or not they want to seek, whether or not they're going to pursue a case is so critically important. The other thing is this, you know, when I was a prosecutor, and interestingly enough, that's how I met Robert and Carl, because I was just so interested in criminal justice reform and doing what's best, not only for the young people in juvenile court, but some of our young adults who were being prosecuted in the felony courts and the misdemeanor courts. And one thing that I heard from the community of formerly incarcerated persons regarding the prosecutors is that they felt that the prosecutor didn't take time to listen to their story. All they saw was a file. All they saw was a police report. All they saw was a probable cause affidavit, but they never took the time to consider, all right, what decisions did this person make in life that brought him or her to me? They never took that into account. And so, you know, I think the role of a prosecutor to seek justice, to not seek convictions, and to try to learn about the person that's in front of them, to try to not just look at this person as another file or another case I can try. Always beware. If you ever see a prosecutor, an elected DA, or elected county attorney, if they're ever there, you know, they're championing their stats about their conviction rate, that's a problem. All right, because the elected DA, the elected county attorney, their job is not to see convictions. Their job is to see that justice is done. And I think there's just so much that can be said with what does justice mean? Because as I said, in one case, it could certainly be something different than other cases.
Absolutely, you know, and I appreciate that feedback. You know, one of the things, and I think that's a great segue to have a little conversation now with Carl, because of the number of resources that may or may not be available. Now, Carl, if you'll just talk a little bit about the work that you do and how that may relate to resources that are made available during the reentry process.
Well, I primarily work with adults. Building Promise in 2021 became the coordinating agency for reentry services for the city of Austin. And, you know, there always existed an ecosystem for reentry, but everybody worked in silos. So in the city's genius, they wanted to create a hub where folks can come and do the one-stop shop thing. You know, what we've become is a single point of access to connect people to resources. But in light of what we're talking about, I have a question. You know, when people build pipelines, there's a reason and there's a rationale for building it, you know, but, you know, I don't have school-age children. And the question is why does this pipeline exist in the first place? Right? That's a question I have. You know, is it intentional? Or is this just something that just appeared out of the air, right? Or is there some intention behind it? Because if we can deconstruct the intention behind the pipeline itself, then there's room for creating the solution or cutting the pipeline off, right? So it doesn't flow anymore. And I don't hear those type of discussions in context of community. You know, there's a word, and I just learned it, so I wanted to use it here. Epistemology. Epistemology is the study of thought, right? And so what is it in the epistemological process of a child, right, that gets them to behave in a certain way? Listen, I was afraid of Carl in Virginia, right? Carl in Virginia with my parents, right? They would come to school and they would escort. I was more afraid of them than anybody else. That doesn't exist anymore, I don't think, right? Where is our responsibility in context of community, right? You know, my mother was a teacher for 40 years, but she didn't have to be a babysitter. She was a teacher, right? She didn't have to be a disciplinarian. She was a teacher, right? So the discipline began somewhere else, and the children and youth conducted themselves in a certain way. And I don't see that happening in the context. So one, why does this pipeline exist in the first place? And wherein lies the responsibility of cutting the pipeline off? And what are the causal sources, right, that make the pipeline exist in the first place?
Yeah, you know, now that probably is a very complex question, but we all have to look back years in terms of the development of these systems that are designed to protect children as well as protect the community. Go back to when children were housed in certain types of boarding homes and those kinds of scenarios that did not have any real link to those children. They were just warehousing the children, perhaps because of the parents or because of the delinquent conduct. You know, and I have to admit that as a professional in juvenile justice and understanding the complex nature of those children who do come for services. And you've broken that out very well. Each one of these children are individuals, you know, and it would be so critical for us to take that 360-degree look at that child to understand those pieces that relate to, as Brother Bob said earlier, the trauma, the complex nature of all of the things that he had to deal with. And rather than the situational things. Now we're in a situation here today where we're talking about working to interrupt this pipeline and to get to this place of understanding how do we do that. But we have professionals who are working with these children, and whether or not they are fully engaged to that extent. And I'm hopeful to get questions as it relates to what professionals are doing, working with these children in order to paint a better picture of these children. So conduct disorder, another way, can be just a child reacting to trauma, you know, but that's the diagnosis they have to live with. So I'm excited about the opportunity that we have now to put some of those questions out there, and then maybe some of the answers in terms of resources for our children. One of the things that we're faced with today are, for example, policing in schools. Our police now schools are being required to have a armed officer. The idea behind that, I do believe, is to protect the children from outside predators. But is that something that we think that's really going to work? What feedback do you have in that regard, Robert?
First of all, thank you again for allowing me to participate in this very important conversation. One of the things, my friends, all the guests that are here with us today, we concluded in our preliminary discussions of this topic was that we knew we weren't going to resolve this issue in one conversation. So the hope that we had for each one of you all was to spark a determined interest in studying and learning more about this phenomenon. That's number one. Carl lifted up a very important point. He asked, what is the reason this pipeline exists? Now, this is where I feel very compelled to speak forthrightly. You know, back in the civil rights era, we were pushing, many of our civil rights leaders pushed for desegregation and integration into the school systems. We had our own separate school system. We're talking, and why is this important? Because the research shows that disproportionately African Americans and Latino children are negatively impacted by the school to prison pipeline phenomenon right here in Austin. And I have you can go look it up online. This is a local issue. This is not this is a national problem, but it exists here locally, where again the facts bear out. You can just go to the Austin Public School website and you can look at the board goals for monitoring report, and you can find their indicators of what they consider their goal and their progress measures. I won't have time to go into all of it, but suffice it to say that this right now is a local issue. They've just, because of the governor, we are now responsible for putting more police in the schools because they've made that a priority, as opposed to putting more social workers and counselors in school, when in fact, they have a backlog of cases, hundreds of cases of students who have potential diagnoses and need for special education supports that are not receiving that support. Why is this happening? Carl indicated that by suggesting that question. Historically, this society has never favored Black persons or people of color. And this response is consistent with that historical phenomenon. And so I think it begs the question of how much of what we're doing today can be achieved if we don't center what's the phenomenon of white supremacy and how that plays out in structural and institutional racism. We are considered a superfluous population. You know, you go back to the 90s, between 1984 and 1996, look at the congressional record, and you'll see where that was the beginnings of the development of a very rigid police response to what happened in the 70s, which was the gains that we were beginning to make from the 60s, which was the civil rights era. And so as a response to those things, more police funding was delivered from the Johnson administration through the Law Enforcement Administrative Assistance Act. And ultimately, we became more determined to control the Black community so that we could never again allow this kind of uprising that we saw between, let's say, 64 and 68. And so what's happening in the school system is just an expression of that fear and that concern and that need to control. And until we begin to honestly look at those historical trends, I think we'll be continuing to reach into the dark looking for answers that we might not find unless we factor in how this society has historically continued to repress and oppress persons of color.
Thank you.
And if I could add, I just want to give a scenario and just show you how easy it is. All right. Consider this: a student in class is having some disciplinary issues and they want to walk out of class and the teacher stands in front of them. The student shoves the teacher just out of the way to get out of the class. All right. Now that shove causes this teacher to experience some type of pain. She says, ouch. Do you know in the state of Texas, that's all you need for bodily injury? Did it cause pain? Did it cause her to say, ouch? All right. You have an assault, all right, which is ordinarily a Class A misdemeanor. Now you multiply that with the fact that teachers are considered public servants in the state of Texas. So rather than a Class A misdemeanor, a Class A assault, now you have a third-degree felony assault on the public servant, 2 to 10 years in prison. All right. That's how easy it can happen when we're talking about criminalizing behavior. All right. Just this child acting out, you know, a disciplinary, they could be reacting to some trauma, and kids react to trauma in very, very different ways. All right. Just that reaction is now a third-degree felony. Okay. And so when we're talking about systems designed to oppress and designed to criminalize our children, look, the prison industrial complex, they want new clients. Well, who are their clients? They're going to be folks who are charged with crimes. All right. And so this system, the system that we're living in, the system that we have created, it promotes this school to prison pipeline, because the prison industrial complex, they need customers to keep the business going. And so you have to think about it in that context, and people need to understand these types of things, that the systems, my gosh, they're almost set up against our kids to fail. I just wanted to add that in there.
But let me add that if, you know, the other ingredient is bias, right? Because if the teacher gets pushed by a white child, that assault may never get talked about. right? And then we go back to the adultification comment, right? So another ingredient, if justice was meted out equally without bias, right? Then the prison to school pipe, then there'd be an issue. There'd be some backlash and retrenchment if the other folks were going too, right? And so we must include the variable of bias and who's making the judgment call on how that's meted out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. I mean, you guys have really hit some key points in all of what you said. But one of the things that I think is just so critically important for us is that so much of this is playing out right here in front of our very eyes. And sometimes we don't recognize the effect, cause of the effect, et cetera. So now here we're faced with even our governor is calling soon a special session to discuss school funding, actually charter schools, and using public funds to fund charter schools. And in so many instances, we see our public schools are left without the resources that they need necessarily. And so there's always this challenge of kids then with their behavior problems moving in Travis County, being referred to Gardner-Betts or something very similar. One of the questions that I saw noted, and I don't know if I see there's a group of folks from Gardner-Betts online, and there is a question, well, what does Gardner-Betts do for some of these children? What are some of the alternative methods that are used currently? So maybe there's somebody who want to respond to that. You can just simply raise your hand if there is a person. But we're going to go on to yet another question in the meantime. And understanding that our children are the living messages that we send to a time that we shall never see. Our children are living messages that we send to a time that we shall never see. So when I think about that, I think about some of the things now that the parents are faced with and how that may be occurring with them. How a single mother cannot attend a PTA meeting because the school does not allow children in the PTA meeting. So the mother has to make a decision. Do I pay this additional money for babysitting, or do I not attend the school session? I care about my children and I want to participate in that. So there are challenges like that that are facing our populations all the time. Understanding the need, knowing that there's a need to understand the culture of poverty. So they're our technicians and those people who are responsible for providing services to our children. They're being faced with a lot of circumstances that may impact them adversely. So if you will, Carl, if you could just talk a little bit about some of the things that you see as a result. Now, this also understanding that you're dealing mostly with adults who were once children. These are now these messages that have become adults. And now what are they providing for us in the way of information? And how do you really help them to take another positive step in their lives?
So, two things. Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing, absolutely nothing without demand. I think I messed that up a little bit, right? And so, that single mother you were talking about, are there a group of mothers saying, well, okay, I can't attend, but you can put them online, right? And I can attend, right? Are we demanding those things, right? And speaking to power in that way. And so that's our responsibility to speak to power and change it. And when you talk about those things, there's a word I work with. I'm in Wakanda, 6633 Highway 290 East. There are 25 African American nonprofits in one building, right? And we have a mentor program. And I walked into the room and I called my boys niggas, right? I said, hey, my niggas, right? And I asked them, what did that word mean? And they laughed. But it's an Ethiopian word for king, right? And so are we affirming, the gentleman that I have here with me, we just started a program called RESPI, the reentry self-sufficiency pilot initiative, where we're taking people coming back who have come back from prison and getting them workforce ready. And we're doing a earn as you learn concept. I know I can't get people workforce ready in a month, but what we're trying to do is prove concept, right? But the negative affirmations that they've grown up with, right? And how do you take that? We talked about paradigm shifts, and when the paradigm shifts, all the rules change. I put up on the board, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is, right? And so what are we, both the children and these men that I'm dealing with, and we're dealing with a cohort of women next, but what is their self-knowledge about themselves, right? Because if my self-knowledge is one way, I'm living in this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You like your daddy and your daddy's this, right? And now I take on the fact that I look just like my father, so I'm going to be like him. I'm going to act like him, and I'm going to live out that prophecy. So now it's about shifting the paradigm, and shifting the trajectory of the people that I'm working with. A young man, his name is Fausto. I won't tell you his last name because of, but he came in saying, I do construction, that's all I do, right? Well, we introduced him to the African Austin Urban Technology Movement. Now he's thinking about working in technology, right? He got his laptop computer, and that's where he's going, right? All we had to do is shift his paradigm, right? And expose him to something bigger. And once we expose him to something bigger, the trajectory of his life is taking a different road.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes important that as we look at these young people, have they seen, are they still on the block, seeing what the block has to offer? Are we taking them beyond the block to see what potentially they can make of their lives, right? And give them those experiences, those positive experiences that counteract the ones that they're in, right? So I guess that's my contribution.
And I thank you for that. Craig, your work now is involved with jails to job. Tell us a little bit about how that works and the impact that you're having on your population.
Yeah, I'm a recovering criminal justice professional, obviously. The work that I'm doing now, and wow, I've really come full circle because, I come from a history of working as a prosecutor, and now I'm leading a nonprofit organization here in Texas that work directly with young people that have been impacted by the criminal justice system, to operate an employment-based mentoring program for them with the ultimate goal of reducing recidivism and getting them a job after they finish our program. And so we generally work with young people between the ages of 17 and 25. And I know we have some folks from Gardner-Betts, and we're just kind of talking about what we could do. I mean, I would love to partner more with the folks at Gardner-Betts, because when the young people, leave detention, send them to us and send them to other nonprofits that are doing the work in this space, because we are looking to work with young people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system. I really don't like that word, youthful offenders. Sometimes programs say, well, we work with youthful offenders. I like to think that when a young person gets into my program, they're no longer offending, all right? And they're not likely to reoffend. And so I still think that those labeling terms are so critically important. That's why I say young people that have been affected or impacted by the criminal justice system. And so I think it's so important to reach them at this age so that you can change the trajectory of their life. And programs like Jail to Jobs, like LifeWorks, some of the other programs doing great work in this space, you can empower a young person, say, look, you're more than the sum total of your life choices, okay? You can be someone, and we have to constantly speak those words of encouragement and power and leadership into the lives of young people, because, I really think young people, they become ultimately what we shape them to become, all right? And so it's about speaking positive and affirming thoughts and testimony into their lives. And so we work with young people in Travis County and Williamson County. We take them all. It doesn't, some people say, well, what if they committed really serious offenses? Send them our way. All right. We want to work with young people. We're not going to leave anyone. We're not going to close the door on any young person that wants help. And we need more organizations doing the work in this space. I know in the next panel, we're going to talk about reentry services and kind of where they start and things of that nature. But we want to partner with folks in law enforcement, prosecutor's office, Gardner Betts, and say, when you're done with them, send them to us.
That's fantastic. Robert, you have something you want to add to that?
Yes, I just want to emphasize that, you know, one of the ways that I described myself in my bio was that I was impacted. The reality is that my entire life has been circumscribed by policies, politicians who have embodied those policies, and institutions that have carried out the mission of those policies. One of the biggest things that I've learned over the course of my years in trying to remove myself from the clutches of this system is that you cannot respond to a social problem with personal solutions. You have to respond to a social problem with social solutions. And to the extent that I believe that, I have determined that my quest is not to fight what's happened to me alone. I'm a member of grassroots leadership, criminal justice, participatory defense organizer, and part and parcel of what we represent is the idea that we have to build a base of people that have been active. That means family members and folk who have been incarcerated have to band together with allies who believe that what is transpiring in our society can be undone because it was done intentionally. And just as it was done intentionally, then we can together work to raise our voices, to participate in the electoral process, to push forth leaders that we see representing our values. We have to respond to this from a community based, interest level. But this cannot be something that we put the onus on the person who themselves finds themselves ensnared in the criminal legal process and say, oh, just change the way you think. Granted, the way some of their thought process have to be changed, but if you change me, if you take me off of cigarettes and then you send me back into a home where everybody smokes the cigarettes, the likelihood that I'm going to return to smoking is extremely high. So we have to look at the conditions again, and we have to figure out ways that we as a collective can change those conditions. I'll read this last quote and then I'll yield because I know our time is just about up. It's an analogy between preventative criminology and preventative medicine. A society with poor sanitation that breeds disease will need a lot of hospitals in reaction to these illnesses. Fixing the sanitation, thereby preventing the majority of outbreaks, however, would remove the underlying cause of the diseases and provide a more human and efficient means of controlling the problem of crime or whatever the illness is in that society. Instead of treating the criminal symptoms of a sick society with incarceration, cure the society of the underlying disease causing crime. And to me, the great extent of what we're dealing with on every scale of human quality of life for African Americans and people of color find themselves faring poorly. This is not accidental. This is part and parcel of a historical phenomenon called white supremacy in our society that continues to devalue one set of people to the advantage of another. And all of our responses to that, I believe, must be infused with anti-racist undergirdings so that we can reinforce removing this scourge from our society. Thank you.
I mean, you said that's just tremendous feedback from you, Robert. I appreciate that. Very quickly, Gardner Betts, is there anybody there to speak to what's going on there with restorative justice? Does not appear to be anyone who want to speak on that, but I can tell you from my experience at Gardner Betts, there's quite a bit that has been going on. I am dated and I would prefer something more current. I see the speaker is freed up.
Hi, Emmett. This is Melissa Unterseer. I do want to really appreciate, there's some of us here that are happy to see you up here facilitating this, and it's been excellent. I will, and Craig, recognize you as well. So I do want to share, we do have various restorative justice and transformation projects that we're working in partnerships with different agencies to develop. And I will say diversion is a very strong initiative here, and looking at, we definitely value the comments that have been made and are even looking at training and different programs so that we can impact the youth that we're serving in a way that isn't criminalizing them, but really helping them and diverting them away from our system.
I really appreciate that, and I know that we probably could spend a little more time, and maybe in our next one we would have an opportunity to hear a little bit more from Gardner Betts and some of the things that are going on there, because it is, and I believe, an outstanding department doing things that are uncommon in juvenile probation's department across this state. But in the meantime, I want to thank you all for joining us. I think we've had a great conversation. Of course, we've just gotten on the threshold of that. I don't know if there's a burning desire or question that needs to be answered, but we'll be here every third Wednesday of the month at 1:30. And if you'll consider joining us on the Facebook page, you will have an opportunity to continue to ask questions and make inquiries. Please don't forget that you have an opportunity to get your CEUs. Those links should be at in the chat box. And at this point, Lady Jane, if there's any burning desire, any question that we need to have fielded, do we see it?
Yes, there is a question about parental responsibility in all of this.
Well, who want to take that one on? I think it is such an obvious challenge for us. And part of the statement that I made about the living messages that we send to a time we shall not see, these are now parents. And sometimes they've had some things downloaded into them that are now continuing with their children. And I think opportunities for children, parents to be trained and educated and given opportunities to express social groups that allow them to express their challenges, I think are very important. Carl, Robert, Craig, you have anything else you can add to that?
Well, I just want to send a shout out to all the single mothers out there doing their level best to raise their kids. I'm a product of a single mother, and I'm a living testimony that, you know, I've heard the statistics that, you know, for young Black men who are raised by unwed Black mothers, they're destined for a life of crime. Look here, that didn't happen to me. And so I'm living proof that the statistics do not always ring true. And I know that parents can do more, but my gosh, some of these parents are under some significant strains. Mm-hmm. And so we certainly want to, you know, give a shout out to those men and women who are doing their level best. I mean, children nowadays are just bombarded with so many more temptations. I mean, you can access things on the internet nowadays that, my gosh, 20 or 30 years ago, it would be unheard of. And trying to navigate that as a parent is tough. And so while I know that parents are sometimes criticized for, you know, the children who are having a lot of this disciplinary problems in schools, we also want to make sure that we understand that parents are under some enormous stress nowadays. And so I just wanted to share that personal testimony.
I'll just say this really quickly. You know, the question is a bit, you know, it's difficult to answer the question because it seems like it's not fully being articulated. There may be greater insights that we could gain if we ask that person exactly what do they mean, what about the parents? There's no one size all assessment that you can make or response that you can make, because people's lives are as different as they are human beings on the face of this earth. So what about the parents? There's a whole lot that could be said about the parents. And you know, so I don't want to draw from this the lack of available information negative assumptions. However, I will say this: at the end of the day, every person's circumstance needs to be evaluated with a distinct eye for the fact that, you know, no two people's situations are the same, and I can't make it a judgment or determination in anybody's affairs until I get close enough to them, inquire about their situation, and then I can better assess what, if anything, I can do in response to their need. That would be my contribution to that thought. And I'll say that I left my email in the chat. If anybody wants to connect with me, I can also be found on social media, on Facebook and also on Instagram. If anybody would like to continue to explore this conversation apart from this space, that could be done as well. Thank you for this opportunity, Lady Jane, and also Carl and Mr. Moore. Thank you both for your participation, and also Mr. Hayes.
Carl?
Yeah, my final comment is it still takes a village to raise a child, right? And we always talk about going to the parents, but the parent, we've never had a mass conversation between the parents and the children. Right? If they're in the belly of the beast, and we're advocating for them, shouldn't you talk to people you're advocating for? And so it bears to have an experiment that we begin to start talking to the kids and having frank conversations with them, because they know a whole lot more than we do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we're not talking to them. We're
Mm-hmm.
talking at them, right? And so that's my contribution.
That's great feedback, and it's a great segue to talk about the 2024 Central Texas African American Family Support Conference, February 6th. There's still opportunity to offer presentations if you get your papers in. The conversations that Carl just mentioned, that's opportunities that are available there. We just need you folks to be participating and engaged. It'll be a one-day conference this year, but next year, our 25th anniversary, we're looking for things to be bigger and better. Until we meet again next month, be well, stay safe, and we see y'all around the ranch. Thank you.